I mean, I watched the whole Maps of Meaning lecture series, and then I listened to the first 10 hours of the Maps of Meaning audiobook. And I re-downloaded it recently, but I was like,
It's actually not a great read, to be honest. Like,
no, it's very technical and it's not nearly as good as his lectures and all that. But anyway, so you said you departed. So do you think that? Do you have any issue with the underlying ideas put it forward in the Maps Meeting?
No, not necessarily. I'd still chime in and like listen to him talk to like John Vervaeke and stuff like that. Whenever it kind of comes back to that kind of topic,
Yes.
I may from time to time. I haven't in a while. I think the last thing I did watch, and that was like the first one in a long time I'd watched, was the discussion with Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
But that was also kind of with having you in the back of my head.
Yeah.
But so like when it comes to that area, I'm still kind of roughly interested. But I got interested in Jung through Peterson, and as soon as I started reading Jung, I realized that there's way more to get. Yeah, there's just way more to get out of it. So I think at this point I'm at 10, 11 books I've read by Jung.
Nice.
So that's just provided me with much more stuff and material. And then also I got into like German philosophy. So philosophically, I got way more into like Nietzsche and Heidegger, things like that.
German philosophy is famously devoid of any intellectual heavyweights. Famously devoid. I have a somewhat similar experience where Peterson's good rhetorically. So like he's a good entry point into philosophy, like conceptually. And for me, it was and I was thinking of this analogy as you were talking, is like the spine of like if I'm building a boat and the boat is my philosophical worldview, the spine of the boat was Maps of Meaning. But it's getting to the point where it's a lot of Ian McGilchrist now. I don't know if you're certainly I think we've talked about it before.
Yeah.
Ian McGilchrist, George Lakoff is another guy, Metaphorical Cognition. Some of the original pragmatist stuff, like William James and I haven't read much C.S. Peirce. CJ the X loves C.S. Peirce. But it feels like there are now more spines that are running parallel to this Maps of Meaning one. The Maps of Meaning one is still the original spine, just because that's the terminology I was first introduced to. But yeah, it's interesting to see it grow, and it's interesting to see the syntheses that we both identified, however long it was. It was funny when you told me, because I said I have a theory called archetypal memetics. You're like, that's funny. I have a theory called mimetic archetype. Wasn't it mimetic archetypes?
It was mimetic archetypes. Yeah, I got
convergent mimetic evolution. Look at that.
I got the notes on that somewhere. Yeah. I actually read Dawkins' books as well. What was it? The
Selfish Gene?
Selfish Gene and the Extended Phenotype.
I tried reading the Extended Phenotype.
It's way more technical.
It's way more. The Selfish Gene is great. Yeah. And I was like, and it's because the Extended Phenotype, I was like, this is a more interesting concept, it seems like. But yeah, the first like 20, 30 pages, it got pretty like, oh shit, we're talking about like, I don't even remember what it was. I think I remember he mentions early on like a statistical analysis of causality, where technically if you say some X causes Y, what you really say is that when X occurs, there's a 99.99% statistical probability that Y else. And then it broke it down a bunch, and I was like, yeah, I'd rather be talking about memes, but
yeah, I mean, there's interesting convergences. There's one that I particularly like is the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, Swiss physicist. He's known for the Pauli exclusion principle. Have you ever heard of that? It's, when there's two electrons that are measured and one is measured in one state, for example, something called spin up, then the other is necessarily in spin down. So they kind of always, each state excludes each other. You'll never measure two of them in the same state, which always seemed like a spooky kind of action at a distance. There's no communication between the electrons, but yet they always know to be in the other state than the other one.
Sure.
And
so
he was
some entanglement type stuff.
Yeah. That's part of it. Yeah. Quantum entanglement works according to the same principle. And then there was this whole concept of synchronicity by Carl Jung.
Yeah.
And Pauli actually ended up being a patient of Jung's. And then after they were kind of done with their therapy sessions, they would send letters to each other. And so there's the Pauli-Jung letters. that you can buy as a book, and where they kind of exchange psychological or psychoanalytical concepts and their kind of correlation with physical concepts. And this is super interesting, and a very interesting kind of avenue where they like go down, looking at how space and time are kind of complementary correspondences, and then like synchronicity is just the missing piece of the puzzle to causality. There's like space time, and then there's causality and synchronicity, and that kind of concept was not really developed any further. It just remained with their letter exchanges until like a Swiss, not overly known professor called Harald Atmanspacher, very complicated name. He wrote, he continued like actual academic research on it. He's a physics and philosophy professor, or retired now, and a friend of mine actually. And he developed something called dual aspect monism. So it's like he took philosophical concepts, and he's also influenced by like Jung, by people like what's his name, Spinoza, and Schelling and other philosophers, where like there is a kind of a monism that is without differentiation, out of which the mental and the physical arise as two aspects of it. So there is a kind of philosophical explication for how these correlations occur between the mental and the physical, and that they are essentially the basis for being able to even apply science or apply theories to the material world and them actually making valid predictions. There needs to be some sort of underlying unity between them, an underlying kind of congruence, right? Yeah, that's something I wanted to definitely mention as well.
I mean, I did a Q&A, and one of the questions were like, what's your religious beliefs? I didn't mention synchronicity, but it's like, it is, I don't know. It's so easy to, and probably true, I don't know, to say it's just like they're just coincidences. So here's the thing. I don't have a solid, I don't have any grasp whatsoever of anything really having to do with theoretical physics and stuff. But when you mention like, okay, Jung and a physicist are exchanging letters and trying to synthesize these things. Yeah, because I don't know. There's all, I don't know if you're watching like Christian apologists. They try to use like logic to explain God and stuff. Well, logically, you have to believe in God because you have to presuppose a first cause. And they're like, oh, you're just going to argue your way into getting people to believe in God. It's like, that's so divorced from, I don't know, spiritual life of like, well, I'll use computer logic to figure out if there's a God.
Yeah. The cause of all things is not something you can really bow down to, and
yeah, like and just as a proposition. Well, okay, there we go. It's now, yeah.
You can't really like sacrifice at the altar of the logical cause of all necessity or whatever.
You can't have a relationship with it in some sort of like, I don't know. It gets so complicated. And honestly, one thing is having watched Peterson enough and having watched people rake him over the coals, rightfully so, for being so like, well, that's not really the point of the question. It's like the Richard Dawkins conversation. Like, Jordan, surely you understand that when he's asking, was Cain and Abel a real person? You know what he means. He's like, yeah, but that's not the point of the question. It's like, that's a different, then you can say that. And so I'm kind of very inclined to be like, I don't even, I would, in order for me to speak confidently on any of like, well, what is the metaphysical nature of reality? It's like, I'd have to have a grasp of theoretical physics and stuff. And I don't, but like just the idea of, oh, wait, hold on. I know Jung, quote unquote. I know some of Jung's ideas some of the time. If I could have that be the metaphor or the base, something that I do kind of understand and build out of it, then it's like, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, let's get into this. I'd say like some of the concepts that would, take a bit more fleshing out in your video would be definitely something like archetypicality.
Yeah.
Right.
Archetypicality.
That'd be definitely something to like tackle and get into. Like, for
Okay, hit me.
example, is there like, what is the difference between a meme that you consciously create, that you consciously kind of manufacture, engineer, and a meme that you just can't help but spread, but be part of? Like, is there a difference between memes that are above and below the threshold of consciousness?
Conscious memes and unconscious memes. I'm gonna have to add it to the framework right now.
Right. I mean, that's an
100%.
important question, because that's something that Dawkins kind of falls short of in his memetics, right? He kind of makes these radical distinction between software and hardware, which interestingly got kind of tackled by Peterson, speaking of like the potential Baldwin effect and the diffusion of memes into our genome. And but the question remains, it's like, where do they come from? And like, why are the archetypes memes in a sense that aren't fully graspable? And why are they not fully graspable? And one possible way of looking at it is potentially they were around before we were conscious, right? Like, for example, would you say that birds have a word for mother, like in a very broad sense of
linguistic sense? No.
In a broad sense of the word, right? It's like, do they have a signal? Do they have a meme for?
They might have what about birds? They might have a specific chirp they make for different things of different significance. Like they might have one for predator. I don't know about mother, but
I mean, like or like to call their mother. Are there mammals that have a certain kind of meme that would, refer to their mother, something like that?
I don't know. Do they?
Like
chimpanzees probably do.
It's obviously like up for debate, but I mean, if there was such a thing, you can easily imagine us having had a mother meme, or a kind of meme that is tied to the mother before we were conscious, before humans were able to reflect about it.
Yeah, so I would say
that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I would say, well, even Dawkins describes mimetic spreads within animals. Like he gave the example of English tits, or blue tits and gray tits, which is the bird, by the way, not the not the bags of fun. And he described that as having a mimetic nature to it. I think meme, I call it a discrete unit of cultural information. That's one way to define it. That's not very useful. More technically, it is a specific, I think the way Dawkins defines it, like imitatable, or like imitatable. I think it's a behavior, because like he like a tune, like if I whistle, like, or like the knock, like, that knock, dun 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 dun, like that's kind of that pattern is a meme.
Yeah.
Is that a behavior? Well, it's only behavior once it's been acted out, but is that concept, it gets kind of squirrely.
I mean, I guess so. Like that's what I was getting at with the question about mammals. It's like, you can imagine, because like mammals being much older than humans, as an evolved category, you can imagine the memes that would refer, or that would be broadly within the kind of complex of motherhood, being much older than our kind of capability of reasoning with language, right? Reasoning
100%,
using language.
Memes precede language, for sure. Language is a type of meme, but memes preceded language. I mean, music is a meme, and like or like when chimpanzees do their like, like that's more like music than it is like language,
right?
And those are definitely memes.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I wrote down conscious versus unconscious memes. Because conscious memes are memes you create. I mean, that's what art is.
Right.
Unconscious memes would be like, so I had like a hierarchy of like, there's archetypal memes, and at the very bottom, it's like, I called it transitory memes or something, which is like body language in a conversation. Like if I, like if I lean in or whatever, that's a meme almost that you recognize unconsciously, but you're not necessarily
Right.
thinking about or noticing. And
But it's already a good thing.
It only exists in a very like the memes of the body language that we're exchanging in this conversation is relegated to this conversation. Well, I guess it's predicated on other patterns, but yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, it's already kind of a good thing that you're defining it more broadly than just like fragments of language or like memes on the internet and things like that. Because as you're saying very, very correctly, it's like it seems like the medium for our memes has become more and more kind of frontal cortex centered. It's become more and more centered around language. And that's also something that you kind of touch upon when you speak about, you make the distinction about memes being accessible and durable.
Yes.
And you say that the accessibility kind of has to do with the medium. So there's a kind of meme acceleration happening with the rise of like sophisticated spoken language, and especially with the rise of written language, right?
Yep.
You kind of get kind of a meme takeoff.
Yep. And then that it gets exponential with algorithms and stuff that are like auto sorting for. So like I might have 100 memes and I have to go through each one to find out which is the most compelling. But now I have an algorithm that does it for me, which then hyper, it's like a whole big loop there.
Right. It's if you try and like exaggerate the analogies with biology, you get this idea of horizontal gene transfer. You heard of that concept?
Mm-mm.
That like a lot of our genes are not haven't come about through inheritance, but they have come about actually through spreading via viruses and other means. It's called horizontal gene transfer.
Yeah,
there's a certain percentage of our genome that's come about through that, and it seems like memetics has just become a way of like upgrading a kind of horizontal meme transfer, right? It's like, especially using media, for example, you can transfer memes way faster than the, like, you could say, biologically coded or hard coded way of transferring them.
Yeah, well, arguably, because there is no requirement for genetic mutation or passing genes on in the form of sexual reproduction or cloning or whatever, all memetic spread would be horizontal, I would think.
Right.
And then which ones, and then your psyche is configured in such a way that it will pick those memes that are more, like you have a certain shape of spike proteins psychologically, right? And it attaches. I've always thought of that example probably the most of anything, like when it comes to this issue of like your psyche is like has a bunch of like hooks and stuff, and all the different memes out there will only plug in to your psyche, assuming it's the same shape.
When there's a resonance of sort,
yeah, and that's
well, I think as well that like it makes sense to make some sort of distinction. What would be like the analogy to a more reproductive transfer or a more biological transfer as opposed to like a horizontal transfer? I think if you think about humanity for most of its history having lived in small tribal communities, I think the kind of meme transfer was always embodied. It was always directly accompanied by being in physical presence with one another, and being accompanied with a kind of biological kinship as well. And I think the rise of like the medium, especially like the written medium, that is really this kind of either an acceleration or the rise of a kind of a horizontal transfer, the rise of a kind of a disembodied transfer, right?
Sure. Well, I would call this is why I talk about autism so much. It's like you have an idea that when you write it out and take it apart autistically and just say, well, what is this in and of itself, completely abstracted away from all of the interaction with it physically, socially, so on and so forth. That's how you get bad ideas to spread. It's like just I don't know. At least that's That's what
Oh
immediately
yeah,
came to
didn't
mind.
you do something where you said why your haters are probably autistic or something like that?
Yes, why everyone who disagrees with me is probably autistic.
Right.
It is totally not an exaggeration of any kind whatsoever. That I cited John Vervaeke. Or did I cite John Vervaeke in that? Yes, I did, because that was the 4 P's of knowing, where a lot of memes now are all propositional, or at least they appear to be. Like, well, I'm not going to be convinced unless I hear a logical argument. It's like, bitch, you were convinced 2 years ago based on some comedian you saw that you liked who said this one idea, right? It's like,
Right.
that's that. What I don't know. Would that be participatory or whatever it is?
Yeah,
So
he likes his alliterations, I remember.
yeah, the 4 P's.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you something, unless you still have you want to continue down this path. If there's
Just one
you're
point.
coming to. Yeah.
Just one point. It's like there is a phenomenon in nature where certain life forms initially start off as parasitic, but then eventually become symbiotic, right? They eventually kind of start co-evolving. And so I see that, for example, also with the faculties of reason that we have as humans, that like the neocortex in a sense has become parasitic. That's like the whole excesses of modernity, technology, science, all that. It's kind of become parasitic on the limbic system, and we're just kind of like in this pendulum of potentially, in the best case, reaching a kind of symbiosis. And
is there a name for that phenomenon when something starts off parasitical and becomes symbiotic?
I'm not sure, but I actually read about it in one of Dawkins' books. I think it was even the extended phenotype. But it was about some plant or something like that, but I don't remember exactly. It's been a while.
Sure.
But essentially, the reason for these things to fail is if the parasitism is just lethal, if it's just too lethal. I mean, best example is with the viruses, right? If the virus is too deadly, it won't spread much because the first people infected will just die.
Right.
Will die faster than they can spread it. And so essentially you don't, with like viruses like that, you kind of avoid having them altogether. But ones that are weaker, that spread much more, eventually you just kind of start living with them. They just become part, or a lot of the contents of the genome of that virus just become part of your overall immune system, right? And eventually, as we know with horizontal gene transfer, can even become part of your genome. And so what I was wondering, if there's also some kind of analogy you can make with memetics in that case. Is there something like, I guess like you can't have this, you can have a form of biological death as well, but like as it's a social phenomenon, I'd be interested what you'd think. What would be the equivalent of like a meme that's like too lethal? Is it something that just immediately leads to a cult or something? Or like the most extreme example to death, like in the case of Jonestown. Was it Jonestown?
Yep, Jonestown Massacre.
Yeah.
Yeah, where they all drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, Jonestown being like the kind of the ultimate form of the meme being so lethal that it just turns into a cult that commits suicide, right? That being like the one end of the spectrum, so to say, right? The other meme being that it's so weak and banal that it's just kind of spreads and goes forward and backward, but
they're arbitrary, right?
Yeah, not much.
Yeah, which I would say like a lot of like TikTok trends are, it was just like that medium speaks directly to that phenomenon of like we're all familiar with like, oh yeah, I remember I even cited it in the video. You remember the Harlem Shake? Do the Harlem Shake.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, I'm not on TikTok, so I don't know what the kids. Which by the way is, I am being denied a good look at the collective unconscious. I remember when I was on TikTok, I was like, I feel like I'm somewhat in tune with the collective psyche, because it is a bubble. But you also do see a lot of the memes that go mainstream, and you do see trends that everyone sees. And so those definitely would be like the non-symbiotic, non-parasitic, they just wash over. They just happen to like, it's like a tune, not like a deep song, but just something catchy. It's just like that. It just kind of scratches your itch, so to speak. And then, the one that's like, well, what if it's hyper lethal? I mean, the cult example, I think, is that exactly of like, if a meme possesses you so much so that it becomes self-destructive. That's an example of that. I'm thinking like, yeah, I mean, any extreme ideology that requires you to depart from reality,
Suicide bombing, things like that.
Yeah, or even just, yes, because of the idea of infidels and all that, and then the whole afterlife and all that stuff. But I'm even thinking like, if you are of the belief that everyone who votes for Donald Trump is literally as bad as a Nazi, or everyone who votes for Bernie Sanders is literally as bad as, the Bolshevik communists, like that will kill. Like if you really believe that, you would die simply by like, well, obviously the right thing to do is get a gun and protect myself, or just treat everyone like they're evil, and then you just become isolated. Which is why I think reality is the archetypes are what would you say, the standard by which we evaluate how close a meme is to reality. And that was my point with the 6 fundamental archetypes, is like those 6 fundamental archetypes are the complete story, or they're a schema of the complete, they're a map of the complete story. They're not the complete story. Which is, the danger of political ideologies. You only hit on 3 or 2 or 1 when you need all 6, so to speak.
It's an ordering principle. The guy Atmanspacher that I mentioned earlier, the Swiss professor, he refers to the archetypes as ordering principles for our engagement with the world. They are required, kind of our best way of kind of structuring our perception. I think Peterson speaks a lot as well about like needing some kind of value hierarchy.
Yes, otherwise you can't act.
To structure our perception.
When
too much to take in at any given moment.
What is that professor's name? What can I say to refer to him? I know it was some grunting, something. What's his name?
Atmanspacher.
Can I call him Atmans? Professor Atmans?
Yeah, Professor Atmans.
When he says ordering principle, is he using that in like a technical term, like in a physics? Is there such a thing as an ordering principle that's technically defined in some other framework that he's borrowing?
Well, generally
it's an ordering principle.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, he's continued that work that Jung and Pauli had started with, kind of connecting the dots between physics and psychology. And so in some ways there are approaches in his book on dual aspect monism. There are approaches of formalizing ordering principles by using methods from algebra, things like that. But they're all kind of like approaches that are still in their beginning stages, right? Like the bulk of the work was kind of contextualizing this whole Jung-Pauli debate with the more recent debates on philosophical underpinnings of what the role of the observer has become in physics, and how can we actually understand it properly and reconcile it. And the kind of going further and formalizing archetypes as ordering principles, all that's like the next steps to take. That's like he's laid the groundwork for those to be like potential avenues to continue. He kind of lays them out as like potential avenues, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. You wanted to ask something as well before
Peter Boghossian.
Yeah.
He reacted to one of my videos about the meme adoption curve. And he, in that same video, he talked about, he took my video the first 3 minutes, and in the second 3 minutes, he cited David Deutsch. And Deutsch talks about rational versus anti-rational memes. Have you heard this term?
I've heard of David Deutsch, but I haven't heard of that particular.
Okay. I have not. I was told to look into it because I was skeptical. Well, because he said the memes that stick around are what makes memes sticky is the degree to which we can apply rationality to them. So the more that we can critique and refine a meme, the better it sticks around. Whereas anti-rational memes are memes that kind of go off the rails. And I thought that's not at all how that works, because the memes that stick around are the ones that appeal to our primal instincts that are fundamentally anti-rational, right? Like, a meme of you being the victimhood, the archetypal victim,
Right.
is a very powerful meme, and it can cause you to act in very irrational ways, or certainly immoral ways, assuming rationality and morality are linked, which I imagine David Deutsch would put forward, but I don't know per se.
Yeah.
So okay,
Yeah, I
I was
mean
just wondering if you
that's
had
the
heard
whole
of that.
distinction that's the whole distinction that Jung makes as well between the ego and the self, right? That's like, for me, like in my opinion, a more interesting distinction than Freud's distinction of the ego, the superego, and the id is like the distinction between the ego and the self, because kind of also drawing on Schopenhauer a bit, on like philosophy as well. You kind of have this, what Schopenhauer calls the will and the representation, but what's essentially, and Schopenhauer has actually admitted to that, essentially a very old concept that already the ancient Hindus had in the Upanishads, and that is this notion of the big and the small soul, the Brahman and the Atman. It's kind of the ego is that which is always only a kind of an image, an idol of the self, but the self is something that's fundamentally not graspable. It cannot be captured in an image, and so we are always kind of bound to construct an ego, to construct some kind of sense of self, but that can never really grasp the true self, and that's kind of this whole riddle, or this whole task, the quest of modern man, is this quest of individuation, and it's this whole riddle it's almost like our culture and our history has kind of crystallized into this meme of the self. It's like it's taken a long while to kind of go through different phases, and like Jung would say, and probably Peterson would agree, that it's like one big milestone or one big step forward towards it was the rise of Christianity, or the rise of Abrahamic religions in general.
Monotheism out of polytheism. For like, polytheism is more id-like, and then monotheism is that which unifies and mediates between your sort of polytheistic instincts, rage, sex, hunger, fear, all that.
And especially and especially with the figure of Christ, where you have this kind of idea that the ego actually needs to be destroyed in order to come back in the form of the truer self, in a sense, and like that idea was kind of old. It brings together narratives that are similar in the myth of Horus, in the myth of Dionysus, but there was a kind of mimetic selection that happened that kind of converged them or crystallized them into the figure of Christ. And there's just this development towards what then Jung kind of formalized into the ego and the self, and then the kind of consequences out of that. You get the ego not being able to fully grasp the self necessarily creates its shadow. It necessarily is always in a relationship and a kind of tension with that which it has left out, that which it has neglected and missed when trying to capture the self, right? And then you also get the societal aspects of the anima animus. You get this kind of the archetypes, where already predating many years, we started having a way higher selection pressure and environmental pressure given by our social environment. As soon as we had sexual selection, as soon as we had the masculine, the feminine, suddenly our social environment was way, way more important than the natural environment. It had way bigger impact on our reproduction, on our future, on our selective fitness. And so these are, again, examples of like very, very old archetypes, but that are now kind of coming into a context. They're kind of converging into this ego self relationship, because we're now able to reflect on them and question them. And I mean, like, you can see in the culture, we have a very radical culture that kind of questions and critiques all of the relationships of genders, of different identities with one another, of the existence of identities, deconstructing them, reconstructing them. It's kind of coming to a kind of climax.
And Well, first, the point about the social environment, we adapted to the social environment, because that's a point that Peterson Harps talks about a lot. And it's nuanced, because it's like, well, we adapted to the environment. You immediately invoke trees or, fur from cold weather or something like that. But it's like, and I notice this in my personal life. Anytime I'm like nervous in like a social situation, like maybe I have a meeting or something, or an interview that I have to do or something, I'm always like, wait a minute, what's more real? Like physical reality, the fact that I'm going to die, and like all the realities of the physical world, or the interview that I'm about to do that's going to determine whether or not what my life is for the next like 2 or 3 years, whatever, and it's like, it's a tension there, because it's like, I'm using my abstract mind or my reasoning, my prefrontal cortex, to be like, literally, we're all going to die. We're all dust. There's like 1 million people dying every day. And so the idea that I would feel threat or anxiety about this purely social phenomenon, like an interview or something, or even like a party where I don't know anyone, I'm gonna have to be there for a couple hours. I'm like, oh fuck, this could go really bad. Oh, whatever. Like, I don't want to talk to these people. Even that is just like, wait a minute, what's more real here? The social world or all of that? And it's always no matter how much I rationalize, it's always like, well, here I am, and suddenly the social world takes over, and now I'm not even thinking about those things.
Right. Right.
And so that's an interesting phenomenon. I was going to ask you, as you're talking about this, in Origins and History of Consciousness, Eric Neumann. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Yeah, I got it at home.
It's one of, I think it's that one.
I've got The Great Mother by Neumann, and I've got like the most beautiful edition I could find, and I got it almost for free. It's just nice. It's all in gold and with like massive.
Is Great Mother? So I got the Origins History of Consciousness because I thought that was the more overview. Peterson said it's the book that Jung said he wished he wrote, or something like that.
You get like maps in it and stuff like that. Great Mother. Yeah, it's. I think both are worth a read. Like,
so here's the thing.
Origins, I think the one that you have, that you just mentioned, is probably the best overview, and The Great Mother just kind of gets deeper into one of its chapters.
Okay, yeah, because I felt like Great Mother was specific into the mother archetype, where I kind of I need the broader overview before going deep. That being said, I read the first 50 pages of Origins in History and put it down. Although I need to get back into it, but I'm telling you, there's at least 3 or 4 distinct points from those first 50 pages, which is why I want to get back into it, is because it's so rich. One of them being, we were talking about like monotheism emerges out of polytheism and stuff. And I also want to ask you something separately. This idea that, what was the term? Ontogeny recapitulates or what is the term? Like ontogeny recapitulates philology or philology. Basically, what it means is it's a very specific technical, like biological process that he's using as a metaphor for psychological process, which is, and I don't even know if this is technically true. It appears true, but it's not. The idea is, when a human being, or any animal, but a human being is conceived, so sperm fertilizes an egg, the development from egg to full human recapitulates all the evolutionary stages of the whole evolutionary timeline. So literally single-celled organism, egg, I think is a single cell. I could be wrong, but super simple cell. And then what does it look like? It has a tail. Like early embryo has like a tail. Okay, that was when we were fucking,
right,
in a puddle of soup. And then and the idea, and then so that's like an embryonic theory. The idea is psychologically, it's a similar thing, where like if you go back pre-culture, like same human biology, but like pre like what we would call culture, maybe very early culture. Like I mean, Jung says this, like early man was in a dreamlike state. He wasn't thinking consciously. It wasn't like it was more like in a dream where it's kind of all subject to emotions, stuff like that, right?
Right.
As consciousness developed, or language or whatever, something crystallized and honed it and sharpened it and brought it to a point. Like now, culture, like if you just had a baby, like because because biologically humans have been the same since the early Bushmen, so to speak, is I think the Jungian term, as he calls them Bushmen or whatever. If you didn't give a baby, if a baby was not raised with language or culture, it would be like a savage, quote unquote, or like an early tribal person. And then vice versa. If you took someone from like a culture that has no language or very limited, but you raised them in a Western ethic, they would have all the development. So the idea is your culture is the mechanism that causes the evolution psychologically that the entire human race went through since consciousness. Like every human was dreamlike state emotions. Now they're all, not all, now some are, enlightened or whatever, uniting the ego and the self, which is like the higher plane of existence, whatever you want to call it. And the idea is culture is that which fosters the repetition of, I think it's phylogeny or whatever it is. First off, what do you think of that? Does that cause any connections in your mind?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's kind of, I'd say also what von Neumann is addressing in general with his comparisons with cosmological myths, right? With creations of the universe, that there's a similarity of the creation of the universe and the creation of the world once you become conscious as a person, right? And it actually mirrors the more like rigorously formulated theories of Atmanspacher of like the dual aspect monism, where you have this undifferentiated monism, the Ungrund is the German word for it, the foundation that is not a foundation. It's like a non-graspable, undifferentiated, or I think even von Neumann has a word for it. It's like Ouroboros or the Unus Mundus. There's different words that they use for it.
Yeah, the Ouroboros, the snaky
and they kind of crack open. In order for us to recognize a world, there needs to be differentiation happening, and this differentiation kind of cracks open this complexity in that we can experience in the world. And what I find interesting about this early dream state is there's a concept that I kind of think about, that's where I borrow the word archon, which is like a term for like gods, demons, just early primordial entities that are just beyond human powers. That in a sense, the archetypes were living archons. They were actually in that dream state constantly engaging with us, but it was still the phase between full differentiation and full indifferentiation. So it was a phase where they were amorphous. They would switch their appearance. They would switch even their numbers. They would transition into one another. You can see that with Egyptian deities and their different forms. You can see it with the myths of like, I know that Peterson particularly likes the Enuma Elish, the foundation of the universe in the Babylonian tradition, where Marduk kills the dragon and then uses the bones to create the world out of it. There's just this constant flux of substance that you get in these early traditions, and you can find them in Egyptian or Greek traditions, usually with the notion of the older generation of gods. So before you had an Egyptian tradition, before you had Ra and Osiris and Isis and all of them, you had Nun and Atum. Nun being the void, the nothingness, and Atum being the kind of universe, the something that creates itself out of Nun. You have this amorphous creation. Same with the theogony and with the Greeks. You have kind of this whole generation of gods before the Olympians that were the Titans, and who descended from Uranus and Gaia and whatnot. And so I see that as like the archons. That's where it's kind of kicked off. That's where you could say the ultimate divergent meme happened, or the ultimate divergent meme being that of being, in a sense, being that of existence, of something.
Why would that be Why would that be a divergent meme? Oh, meaning because the original meme,
the original divergent
from. Oh, I see. Like the last common ancestor.
Yeah. You could say that like you can call it whatever you would like, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
I'm heavily influenced in that sense by Heidegger. You could say that it is being, in the sense that being has always been missed. It's never been addressed because it's so ubiquitous. It's so mentioned in everything that
Yes.
it's kind of missed. That's what he addresses. He says that the philosophy from its early beginnings has kind of skipped over the question of being. It's kind of missed the question of being,
Yeah, right.
because
Well,
it had already been reverberating in what they've been speaking about, so it was kind of like not to be mentioned anymore.
yeah, and hence
And
the super focus on the propositional without, well, we'll just take for granted that consciousness is here and all this. It's like, no.
exactly. And I mean, the further you go back with the Greek philosophers, the more you get this fundamental, like, questioning, this fundamental eeriness about this strange correspondence between being and thinking, right? The oldest philosophers were all about that, especially Parmenides. And sorry. And what I see now, with coming back to that, I actually, like, you probably didn't really think much more of it, but I mean, I actually found this distinction between, like, archetypicality leading to durability and the medium leading to its accessibility. I found that distinction actually, like, the most interesting, because of my whole thought about, like, technology, philosophy of technology, and these
Yes.
things. It's like the medium has then, like, contributed to the acceleration of this divergence, right? To the acceleration of that. And however, I've been reading the historian Arnold Toynbee, and he made an interesting observation that before all of there's a symmetry in the terms of how technology works, that before all of the human civilization kicked off, there was a certain asymmetry between how quickly technologies could spread and how quickly they were invented in a local area, how quickly new innovations were made and how quickly new innovations could spread. And the idea was that in the early ages, new innovations were so rare that they would spread faster than the new ones would come about. And so there was a kind of homogeneity, there was a kind of similarity across human societies in terms of their technological level. And
like
then
the
for
wheel
most,
being invented in multiple places.
yeah, but I think even the wheel is a bit like high tech for that
Oh,
stage
okay,
we're talking
sure.
about.
Like spears.
Spears, these kinds of things. And then then for most of our known history, you have the opposite. You have innovations happening quicker than they can spread, and you have these different civilizations with different technologies really developing in different ways. And now he said that in recent times we have approached a symmetry with our early history, that we have actually entered an age again where homogeneity is happening because the spread of technologies has become so much more faster than the innovation. And so I see this acceleration that we're seeing as a kind of a mirror image of the archons. I would call them the catechons. It's not a very apt kind of use of these words, but like the catechon was that which came right before the end of the world. It's a religious term.
Okay.
But it's in a sense, I see when people speak about the singularity, the technological singularity and all that, I see that whatever the singularity is as something like the mirror image to the ultimate divergent meme, but just the ultimate convergent meme in a sense. You know what I mean? It's kind of the closure of the loop, the end of the eon, you could say.
Yeah, the end of being, probably, and the end of the world, which is why I
The-
fucking hate the transhuman. Let's be God and let's become God.
Right,
crowd.
right. And if you're into Jung, you have to take the eons seriously, right? Like there's some depth to that, right?
Yeah.
And so
Are we in
what started
Aquarius
off,
right now, or what is that? What is the ending? What's the end all be all eon?
I'm not sure. I think, yeah, the age of Aquarius has like the age of Pisces ended, and like, but like every astrologer dates it at a different year. So some
okay.
people would say we entered it like 200 years ago. Others say we'll enter it in 400 years.
Hopefully we get the Mayan calendar treatment and they're off by some number of years. And 2012 wasn't the exact end.
But what I find interesting is that, like, if language was the initial medium for the divergence of the meme, and now cyberspace is becoming the medium for the convergence of the memes, and if the archons were the embodiment of like real living archetypes, is there a mirror image to that? Are we going to have, through AI, for example, the real embodiment of the inversion of archetypes, not the archons, the catechons, or whatever you want to call them? Are we seeing, like, what is up with, for example, Cortana, Siri, I don't know what they're all, Alexa? What's up with all of them having the same kind of nurturing female vibe to them, right?
That one I would attribute to not an archetype driving that, although maybe the idea of like some, of course, it's all men inventing these things, right? So they would project the feminine ideal as.
But like, you do commonly have in science fiction and things like that, you commonly have a masculine coded AI built for a specific target and a specific goal. It's like, it's phallic, it's like, it's focused. And you often have a feminine coded AI to just be there for everything.
Like, yeah, like Eagle Eye is the or the one from iRobot, right? With Will Smith, Vicky. Yeah. Oh my God. Well, okay, hold on, because you're frightening me in some sense, because first off, the concept of the archons, as I didn't make that connection until now, in terms of like the archetypes are clearly present in dreams, or at least in my dreams. And so if waking reality, if being was dreamlike, as as like a primitive person, then those things would literally manifest in reality as archons, right? As spirits, so to speak. And then the whole point about, language allowed it to diverge, and now it's converging in singularity. It's like, holy fucking Christ. Let me ask you this on archons, though, because curious what you mean. You say the archons are the embodiment of the living archetype. So I get the concept of an
twist. That's just my twist on them, right? Originally, there's like different concepts of them. But originally, there's like the idea of a Neoplatonist called Iamblichus, who used archons to categorize gods into like benign and malignant gods. The archons were kind of like the more distant, abstract, ordering the universe, keeping the laws of the physics together,
clockwork type
gods.
People.
Yeah, and the daemons were more the like mischievous,
active gods. Well, but even then, I guess when you say living archetype, though, because it's sort of like this is the question of like archetypes versus Platonic forms, because they're similar, right? Where it's like archetypes are, in my mind, it's this convergence. The Platonic forms are, they exist in the realm of the forms. Like I don't believe in the existence of Platonic forms per se. Let's just I'll put that for now. I suppose I got my mind changed, but as I understand it, it's not like what makes a donut is the essence of a donut, right, or whatever. It's because it's pragmatic, right? It's what makes a chair is whether you can sit in it, so on and so forth. And so archetypes are real.
Yeah.
But they can't be. So and this is the whole thing about like Christ. Like, well, was Christ God? It's like, well, arguably, if the archetypes are real, then the archetype was made flesh one time, and that was a historical event, so on and so forth. And there's other things.
But you're getting the Platonic forms upside down, if I may.
Go ahead.
Because like the whole concept behind it is that they derive their being always from the most perfect being. So you kind of have to start with the most perfect being and then descend into the donut. You can't really go bottom up from the donut. So
right.
What I mean by that is like the archetypes so far are unconscious living entities. You could say the innovation or the genius of Plato is that you can kind of, with your reason, with your kind of conscious reason, kind of tap into the fabric of reality by engaging with the one. Because you're like, you're not really you're not doing that by engaging with the idea of the donut. You're doing that by entering the union with the one, which is the good, the beautiful, and true.
True. Okay, well, hold on. So when you say the archetype is a living entity, and I'm assuming you're taking that, that's what Jung put forward, right? But here's the thing. In Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, this is a line that sticks out to me. He says, I'm speaking of archetypes as an empirical concept. And he gives the example of arthropods. Like when I say, he talks about the archetype of the anima, he's referring to a empirical family of behaviors that he calls the anima. And he says it's an empirical concept like arthropods. Like arthropods as such do not exist. Like there's no platonic form of the arthropod. It's a useful grouping, but it's an empirical one nonetheless. So when you say living entities, what do you mean by that? Archetypes as living entities?
Yeah, it's a difficult one.
Are you speaking more metaphorically?
I mean,
obviously in some sense, because they're not.
In some sense, in some sense, metaphorical.
Yeah, this is where it's fun.
In the sense that a living entity, like you and I were, as to take like an old cliche, we are spirit and matter. We are a body and a mind, right? So a living entity is something that's intuitively you wouldn't just reduce to, oh, you mean a body, oh, you mean a spirit. You understand intuitively that it is this mysterious and complex interplay between matter and spirit. And that's the idea of the archetype as an ordering principle. It is this stage between the undifferentiated oneness that we can't really speak about, that we can't say much about, and the fully differentiated, like crystallized hard reality, so to say, hard, or rationalizable reality. This kind of blurry area is where the archetypes are located, and that's why they constantly are in flux between the material and the mental.
Sure.
And so and you can see in Jung's intellectual development that he kind of converges towards that idea. He starts off as like a purely regular, so to say, psychologist, psychoanalyst, thinking of the archetypes as psychological patterns, but then at some point they become patterns of behavior, and then at some point they become kind of structures, and then it's like they progressively become more and more, they take on a different shape, a different idea. And then at some point when you get to the letters that he's exchanging with Pauli, then they're kind of ripe for that, or they're ready for that encounter with Pauli. They're ready for that exchange with the physicist, because they have become something other. They've become something that's prior to the differentiation of the two realms, and therefore cannot be categorized into one of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, because you can't ever capture the archetype. There's the archetype, and then there's the archetypal representation, and you can have an infinite number of images that cluster around the central concept, but you can never grasp the central concept. And those archetypes that most grasp it are the most abstract. Like a circle for the Ouroboros.
And that's what idolatry is. That's why idolatry is, right?
Is mistaking the representation for the deeper thing it's supposed to be representing, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah. They're like reducing the archetype, for example, to a material body.
Sure. Like, not separating the idea of sovereignty from the sovereign. Like, there's the idea of the king's power versus the king himself.
Yeah. I mean, you could almost say that a lot of the monotheism reduces the archetype to the purely mental, and a lot of the idolatry reduces it to the purely material, to the statue, to the holy tree, to whatever.
Right.
And And essentially, what if you take that to psychology, if you take it to the ego or self, then egoism is essentially a form of, or narcissism, whatever, is a form of idolatry of the ego. It's kind of worshiping the ego as being the self,
as an idol of the
which,
self.
yeah, which kind of in its irony is like an even more diluted ego with an even more radical shadow, right?
That's funny. Are you Christian?
I'd need 4 hours to answer
I know.
that
I
question.
especially.
What do you
Nice.
mean by R? What do you mean by you? What do you mean by? No, I'm joking. I'm.
Are you religious? Maybe.
I'm both. I've decided not to disappoint any of my parents, so I'm Catholic Muslim, and so I'm gonna
That'll work.
get hated on by everyone. No, I mean
the ultimate fence sitter.
Ultimate fence sitter. I'd say, like, in terms of having them be compatible, probably more consistent to say it'd be Muslim, because I can include Christ as a holy figure that didn't die, and there's in its essence a lot of overlap. It's just like they diverge a lot, and then the cultural
So your mom
rituals and all that.
Your mom was Irish or your dad was Irish?
My dad is Irish.
So I would presume he's a Catholic in that one.
Yeah.
Did you go? So how did you? Did you go to both Catholic church and mosque?
No, I wasn't raised religiously, but my parents are religious, so they just didn't really feel like shoving it down my throat, which was probably a very good decision. So I kind of grew up with a very healthy relationship to it. I didn't, a lot of people that kind of get raised very religiously then develop some sort of aversion to it.
If you don't become a pure fanatic that never questions it, then you become it's disgusting in every manifestation. Interesting. I was just curious. If people ask me if I believe in God, I'm like, probably, but I can't really. Because instead of saying, wow, it depends on what you mean by God, I act as if I believe. No, I just probably, and I'll leave it at that. That's interesting. Do you, and I want to wrap up relatively soon, but are there any key points you wanted to talk about now?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of, because we kind of branch out in many different directions.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the message to take from a lot of stuff that I said is especially this idea that we have kind of entered a phase of radical accelerated convergence of our memes, due to us having submitted most of our reasoning to a kind of very technologized rationality. Rationality and reason used to mean way more things, but all of the others have kind of been selected out in favor of pure technological rationality. Technological rationality actually being a term coined by members of the Frankfurt School, so some cultural Marxism there that I sprinkled in there.
Listen, nobody loves cultural Marxists more than I do. Okay,
right, and what it has made us forget is that the fundamental reality is neither rational or mental or material and physical. It is something that we are in our own being kind of doomed to never understand. And only this kind of this acceptance, that's the paradox of it, right? This acceptance allows us to actually move forward. It's just like the ego that denies itself is actually the most well put together self.
Yes.
Right?
Oh my God, it's the king who doesn't want to be king. It's George Washington who doesn't want to be it's all of that. It's
yeah.
The when you say like the singularity is convergent mimetic evolution, so to speak. So Well, I guess I was going to ask you what does that look like, but that's the thing about the singularities we don't know. But we're converging towards a singularity. Now I get that
And look at
technologically.
China. I mean, China has been developing for thousands of years separately from the West, or almost entirely separately from the West.
Mhm.
And they had developed different technologies, different. They had gunpowder way earlier than the West, but didn't really use it much for warfare. Then the West had the steam machine way before, and like the culture and everything had developed so differently. And now, even though for political reasons, US likes to pretend or act like there's a huge clash of civilizations and huge distinction. In a strange way, if you look at it, the technological convergence is like happening just as much.
Interesting. Okay, well, let me ask you this, because I think this may be a flaw in how you're thinking about it, at least at one level. And I could be wrong. There's many things I don't know, and U.S. Chinese historical relations would fall into that category of I don't fucking know. But I would think, well, I guess no. On the one hand, it's kind of, I can see it being both ways, where it's like China westernized, right? Historically, like it fell under the influence of Western ideas. So in some sense, their culture now is the result of a divergent mimetic evolution, right? Because they were separate from the Western meme lineage, and then the dominance of the Western meme economically or whatever. That's what I'm saying. I don't know how Chinese Western relations develop, but like the fact that like they have Alibaba or whatever, all these Western McDonald's and all that shit, that was not convergent. That was divergent. That was the result of divergent. Now, it's not like Western values took over China, because they certainly aren't liberal. Like, they've liberalized their economy maybe, and so that was divergent. But they still, I don't know anyone, but the philosophy undergirding it, I presume, is intact. And so in that sense, they may have borrowed the divergent meme complex of the technology, but then the philosophy that's driving it is still converging to AI, godhood, or whatever, right? Developing the thing.
And
I guess,
also the cultural influence. There's I mean, if you look at events happening, like see you kind of have to try and cut through the noise and get to the signal of what's relevant and what you want to look at. It's like, what is a ritual at this point that everyone agrees on, that everyone follows, regardless of political ideologies? If you're like, what's his name, Vosh, or if you're name me someone on the right, Charlie Kirk, or what's his name?
Sure.
Everyone is going to like wake up and check their phone, check their social media, check their, there's the ritual is the same regardless of the content of the ideology. And so there's a certain event happening. I went to New Year's Eve to Las Vegas, and there's some event happening, and everyone takes out their phone and films that event and then posts it on their social media. It's the exact same thing in China. Everyone takes out their phone, films it, and puts it on their social media. You know what I mean? And like, potentially, you can accuse me here of cherry picking the stuff that's similar and ignoring the stuff that's different. But I mean, I'm doing that very consciously.
Yes, I get that. No, I get that.
I'm doing that
because the phone, even though the phone may have spread divergently, the attitude towards the phone is a affordance. It's an emergent. No one is required to take their phone out and film the thing. It's just that's how the phone operates in our psychology, and that relationship is the same.
Right, and what's actually taken over the bulk of our day-to-day like time and our lives, like what's actually the signal and what's the noise, like what's the thing that's actually made us more similar in its kind of nihilistic technological uniformity, right?
Yeah, interesting. There's I do think the future of humanity does. I mean, it's inevitable. It's not like we should do this. It's, well, if we're going to move in this direction, we might as well move in the less bad direction of we Western or Enlightenment or religious, whatever the good set of memes are, whatever you want to call it. Petersonian memes, maps, whatever. Needs to achieve global mimetic hegemony. Right? The only way that we stop nuclear war and the what is it called? The Moloch dynamics, game theory, just stuff, is if we all participate in the same underlying meme complex. And that probably won't happen before we nuke ourselves, unfortunately. But we might. And
we can't end on a black pill.
No, I know. The reason I think that the reason that's not possible, not necessarily, is because, again, if you believe that, as I do, your meme complex, the fitness of a meme complex is dependent on the degree to which it well, in the simplest sense, does not is not against reality, right? The degree that your meme complex is conducive with being, let's say, the more likely it is to survive, quote unquote. So, like, for example, in the Chinese state, they're very anti-gay, right? It's like suppression, suppression, suppression. It's like, well, if you believe being gay is unnatural, bad, blah, 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 all these different things, which I would say are not true, that does not line up with reality, then your ideology has a chink in it. Sorry, that's funny. I may leave that in because that's hilarious. Your ideology has a weakness in it, like the Death Star, the fucking thing straight to the core. And right. I think I like to believe the Chinese ideology, to the degree that it suppresses like gayness and all that stuff. Like, that's one example of it not being in contact with reality to the degree that Western values might be. Although Western values have their share of fucking problems, no doubt. So, that's what revolutions are made of. So if you suppress people long enough, they revolt. And so suppression itself can't be the highest order moral principle for other reasons as well. But yeah.
I mean, what you also have though is, we spoke about this one extreme of a meme or meme complex being the formation of a cult or a societal cult, and there being different degrees. And you could say that like any kind of closed society is just a larger version of that, right? That's like kind of in between something completely open and spreading everywhere and the closed cult. Somewhere in between you get a kind of a closed society, something like what you would potentially classify China as, or something like that.
Yeah.
And the thing is, throughout our history, we've had both kind of. We've had like closed societies being represented by kind of imperial nations like that. I think this has been the modus operandi for China for thousands of years. Like the various Chinese dynasties just functioned according to this kind of closed society principle. Most extremely, you could take another civilization. You could take Japan, that was like for 2 centuries entirely isolated and only allowed like certain Dutch ships to
one ship a year or something like that from the Dutch.
Yeah,
something crazy like that.
Yeah, something like that, right? But at the same time, you always had, in parallel, you had the Hanseatic Society, you had like private, like free cities, trading cities, merchant cities, you had Venice, Florence, these kinds of things at the same time, right? The thing is, only once the closedness, or once the membrane, you could say, becomes too weak, it kind of leads to general dissolution or fragmentation of that society. So you get like the classic example everyone likes to bring up. I gotta find something new so I don't just repeat everyone. It's like the end of Rome, the fall of the Roman Empire.
Sure.
And you got it, splintering off into various different Germanic fiefdoms or kingdoms and things like that. And I think that is the general danger of a open, in a sense, a society that's dominated by kind of open societal memetics.
Yeah, liberal tolerance for everyone and anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Like you get
Paradox of tolerance.
Yeah, I think the prime example for that one, that's the other famous example everyone takes after the Roman Empire, is the British Empire, which you could argue kind of brought about its own downfall through its open market and free market, right? Through kind of propping up these colonies that would eventually want to become independent, right, and splintering off. And you can say the same thing, right, with the United States and its even more upgraded liberalism on steroids, right? Where it's like, it's kind of the American-led system of like the UN and the World Bank and the international community, international institution. It's all stuff that was kind of originated in the US. It's kind of these institutions that have enabled a lot of countries to want to become independent from the US, right? That's this paradox, right?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of like I'm sympathetic to the term populist and anti-establishment and all that on one sense, but anything in excess then becomes, well, I'm anti-establishment. Oh, okay. What's that?
Which establishment?
Yeah, exactly. Or let's say you win. Now what? Now what do you put in their place? Isn't Hannah? I think it's Hannah Arendt who says, might be someone else. The day after the revolution, the revolutionaries become conservative, right? Because they have to implement their thing, and now they're conserving all their revolutionary reforms.
Yeah, I mean, like look at this. I mean, who knows if that's going to happen? Look at these memes about annexing Canada and Greenland and yeah, keep your fingers off of Greenland, by the way.
Greenland will happen. Greenland will happen. I'm confident. Canada, no, that's too complicated.
Keep your Yankee fingers off of Greenland. That's European.
We got listen. Soil. No. We got Alaska. We need Greenland as our two satellite states on either side. We're off balance right now with Alaska to the west. We need another.
You should focus on Canada. You should focus on Canada.
I don't want to. I mean, I get it. They're too fucking. I don't want a bunch of Canadian liberals here. We just talked about the problem with American liberalism. We don't need Canadian liberalism to add to
it. Well, so what I was getting at is essentially like you've got this kind of you got a real powerful kind of Republican right-wing militaristic Defense Department, military industrial complex establishment that wants to use the massive military, that wants to use it to actively, enforce. That and like, enforce its policies through using violent methods, right? There is an establishment that's interested in that. And there is also an establishment, a huge one, that is focused on like the international community and doing it through diplomacy and doing it through, sanctions and these kind of things, right? And like they sometimes align and sometimes they don't, right? And so there's enough people that are like on the Trump bandwagon, on the like Annex Canada bandwagon, that would consider themselves anti-establishment because they're anti like the UN or whatever, anti-supporting Ukraine or, these kind of things, anti-Palestine, Palestinians or something. They consider themselves anti-establishment. There's people on the left that consider themselves anti-establishment because they're anti-Trump and anti.
Yeah, correct. What's the establishment?
Yeah,
that's fair. Okay, I think we'll wrap up here for now. I do have something well, I mean, I don't have to. We could just end it here, or I could stop recording as well. Is there anything you want to say from the recording?
No, I mean, we kind of got off track, anyways, with the.
There is no track. The bean is missed, or the track is missed. We'll definitely talk again and not wait 7 months in between. And also, there's something else I want to tell you. When we're done recording.
Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing much more to say, except maybe buy my book. So it's The Machine.
The Machine.
On philosophy of tech. A lot of the stuff we spoke about, the Archon, Katekon, there's actually a chapter on that in here. So anyone who's interested, get my book or check out my courses. That's it.
Elite. Okay, what I was gonna say is the